Charlotte and Jessica were inseparable, or so it seemed to the outside world. They had grown up in the bustling, chaotic streets of the city, but their destinies had been written in two very different inks. Charlotte was born into a family where money was never a conversation, only a tool. Her skin glowed with the kind of health that only generational wealth could provide. She moved through the world with an effortless grace, the kind that comes from never having to worry about where the next meal would come from. Jessica, on the other hand, had to fight for every breath. She was beautiful, yes, perhaps even more beautiful than Charlotte, in a raw, striking way, but her beauty was hardened by survival. While Charlotte spent her university days planning vacations to Paris and London, Jessica spent hers dodging landlords and calculating the cost of transport. Despite this chasm, Charlotte never let Jessica feel the cold. She was the kind of friend who gave without remembering and received without forgetting. If Charlotte bought a designer bag, she bought one for Jessica. If Charlotte went to a high-class restaurant, Jessica was seated right next to her, eating from the same platter. Charlotte believed they were sisters of the soul. She believed that lifting her friend was the same as lifting herself. But there is a danger in feeding a hungry lion. Eventually, it might decide that the hand feeding it is tastier than the meat. Jessica accepted the gifts. She accepted the clothes, the trips, and the connections. She smiled the smile of gratitude, but internally a cancer was growing. It was a slow burning fire of envy. Jessica began to hate Charlotte, not for what she did wrong, but for what she did right. She hated Charlotte's kindness because it felt like pity. She hated Charlotte's luck because it highlighted her own misfortune. Every gift was a reminder of what Jessica did not have. Every paid bill was a slap in the face of her pride. Jessica wanted Charlotte's life. She didn't want to be like Charlotte. She wanted to be Charlotte. And the only thing standing in her way was Charlotte's breath. The tension shifted from silent resentment to active malice the day James entered the picture. James was everything a woman prayed for. He was young, he was wealthy, and he was kind. He was an energy magnet who carried himself with humility. When he met Charlotte, it was like two stars colliding. Their love was fast, public, and perfect. Jessica watched from the sidelines. She watched as James opened car doors for Charlotte. She watched as he looked at Charlotte as if she were the only woman in the room. Jessica felt that she deserved a man like James. After all, she had suffered more. She had struggled more. Why did Charlotte, who already had everything, also get the perfect man? It felt like a cosmic injustice. Jessica began to position herself. She became the supportive best friend. She was always there. When James and Charlotte had a small argument, Jessica was the one mediating, softly planting seeds of doubt in James's mind while pretending to defend Charlotte. She would tell James that Charlotte was spoiled or difficult, framing it as a joke, but intending it as a warning. She would tell Charlotte that James was distracted or too busy, trying to create insecurity where there was none. But their love was too strong. The manipulation failed. 6 months after they met, James proposed. He rented out the entire rooftop of the most expensive hotel in the city. There were fireworks. There was a live orchestra. And there was a diamond ring that cost more than a house. Charlotte said yes. And as she cried tears of joy, hugging her fiancé, Jessica stood in the shadows, clapping her hands. But in her mind, she was already planning the funeral. The night of the engagement party was the night Jessica decided to cross the line of no return. The venue was draped in gold and white silk. The elite of the city were in attendance. Champagne flowed like water. Charlotte looked ethereal in a custom-made silver gown, a gown she had almost given to Jessica, but decided to keep for this special night. Jessica was dressed in one of Charlotte's old dresses, a beautiful red number that Charlotte had worn once and discarded. To anyone else, Jessica looked stunning, but to Jessica, the dress felt like a prison uniform. It was a symbol of her status as the second best. She watched Charlotte laughing, showing off the heavy rock on her finger. She watched James whispering into Charlotte's ear. Jessica excused herself and went to the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror. She told herself that it wasn't fair. She told herself that Charlotte had lived a long, happy life already. It was time for a rotation. It was time for a change in management. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, unmarked glass vial. It contained a clear, odorless liquid. It was not a violent poison like rat killer. It was something far more sinister. Something she had procured from a dark market dealer. It was a slow fade agent. It was designed to mimic a natural heart failure. It would not kill instantly. It would simply shut down the body's engine, sending the victim into a sleep from which they were not meant to wake. Jessica composed herself. She applied a fresh coat of lipstick. She practiced her smile. Then she walked back out into the party. She made her way to the bar. She ordered 2 glasses of the finest champagne. With her back turned to the crowd, shielding the glass with her body, she uncorked the vial. 1 drop, 2 drops, 3 drops. The liquid vanished into the golden bubbles of the champagne. It was invisible. It was death in a crystal flute. She turned around, her face beaming with fake affection. She glided across the dance floor to where Charlotte was standing. She hugged her best friend, the woman who had fed her and clothed her. She told Charlotte that she loved her. She told her that she deserved all the happiness in the world. And then she handed her the glass. Charlotte, trusting and happy, accepted the drink. She raised it high. She made a toast to friendship. She made a toast to sisters who never part. And then she drank. She drank the envy. She drank the hatred. She drank the poison. The effect was not immediate. Jessica knew she had to wait. She stayed close to Charlotte, laughing at her jokes, holding her hand. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Suddenly, Charlotte stopped laughing. Her hand went to her chest. She frowned, a look of confusion crossing her beautiful face. She swayed slightly. James noticed immediately. He asked her if she was okay. Charlotte tried to speak, to say that she felt dizzy, but her words came out slurred. Her legs gave way. The music seemed to stop as Charlotte collapsed onto the marble floor. The glass shattered. The crowd gasped. James was on his knees instantly, screaming her name. Jessica was there too, acting the part of the devastated best friend. She screamed louder than anyone. She cried tears that looked real. She shouted for a doctor, knowing that no doctor could reverse what she had done. As the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the night, Jessica held Charlotte's limp hand. She squeezed it, not in comfort, but in victory. She looked at James's terrified face and thought to herself, "Don't worry, my love. She is leaving, but I am staying." The hospital became a place of suspended time. Charlotte lay in the sterile white bed, a sleeping beauty who would not wake up. The machines beeped in a rhythmic, monotonous chant, measuring the faint pulse of a woman who was technically alive but practically gone. For the first few weeks, James was inconsolable. He sat by her bedside day and night, holding her hand, praying to a God he hoped was listening. He looked like a man drowning, gasping for air that wasn't there. This was Jessica's moment to shine. She became the pillar of strength. She became the organizer, the caretaker, and the gatekeeper. She managed the doctors. She managed Charlotte's distraught parents, telling them to go home and rest while she kept watch. She slowly, methodically, cleared the room of everyone else until it was just the three of them, the victim, the grieving lover, and the architect of their misery. Jessica played the role of the devastated sister perfectly. She would cry softly in the corner, just loud enough for James to hear, but quiet enough to seem like she was trying to be strong for him. When James forgot to eat, Jessica was there with a warm meal. When James needed a shoulder to cry on, Jessica's shoulder was ready. She wasn't aggressive. She was like water, gentle, formless, but slowly eroding the rock of his resistance. She began to plant subtle seeds in his mind. She would whisper to him that Charlotte wouldn't want him to suffer like this. She would tell him that Charlotte would want him to be happy, to live his life. She framed her manipulation as love. She framed her ambition as loyalty. She made James feel that moving on was not a betrayal of Charlotte, but a way of honouring her memory. As the months dragged on and the doctors began to use words like permanent vegetative state, the vigilance at the hospital decreased. James had to return to work. Life had to go on. And Jessica made her move from the hospital chair to the master bedroom. It started innocently. Jessica told James she needed to stay at Charlotte's house to keep things in order and to be closer to the hospital. James, blinded by grief and gratitude, gave her the keys. The moment the metal keys touched Jessica's palm, a shiver of victory ran down her spine. She wasn't just holding keys, she was holding the deed to a new destiny. Entering Charlotte's mansion alone for the first time felt like a coronation. Jessica walked through the marble hallways, her heels clicking on the expensive floors. She ran her hands over the imported furniture. She went into Charlotte's massive walk-in closet, a room that was bigger than the apartment Jessica grew up in. She saw the rows of designer bags, the racks of silk dresses, the shelves of shoes that had never touched the dirt. She didn't just look, she consumed. She stripped off her own clothes, the cheap fabrics she had bought at the market, and let them fall to the floor. She picked out one of Charlotte's silk robes, feeling the cool luxury against her skin. She sat at Charlotte's vanity table and sprayed Charlotte's signature perfume on her neck. She looked in the mirror and didn't see a thief. She saw the rightful owner. She told herself that Charlotte didn't appreciate these things. Charlotte took them for granted. But she, Jessica, knew the value of every thread. She was simply correcting a mistake of the universe. That night, she didn't sleep in the guest room. She slept in the master bedroom. She lay in the center of the massive bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining what it would be like when the other side of the bed was occupied. The transition from best friend to mistress was not a leap. It was a slide. James was lonely. His house felt empty and cold without Charlotte. But when he came home now, the lights were on. The smell of his favourite dinner filled the air. There was a woman there, a woman who knew him. A woman who looked like Charlotte, smelled like Charlotte, and spoke with the same cadence as Charlotte. Jessica had studied her friend well. She mimicked Charlotte's laugh. She adopted Charlotte's mannerisms. She became a mirror image, a clone designed to fill the hole in James's heart. One rainy evening, 6 months after the incident, James broke down in the living room. The grief was too heavy. Jessica sat beside him, holding him as he wept. She whispered that she missed Charlotte too, that they were the only 2 people in the world who understood this pain. She told him that they were bonded by tragedy, and then she kissed him. It wasn't a tentative kiss. It was a kiss of possession. James hesitated for a moment, the guilt flashing in his eyes, but his loneliness was stronger than his conscience. He kissed her back. In that moment, Jessica knew she had won. The ghost of Charlotte was pushed out of the room, replaced by the warm, living body of the woman who had put her in the grave. 11 months after Charlotte collapsed, James proposed. He didn't do it with fireworks this time. He did it quietly, over a dinner Jessica had cooked. He told her that he couldn't imagine life without her. He told her that she had saved him from the darkness. He took out a ring, a new ring, slightly smaller than Charlotte's, but beautiful nonetheless. Jessica said yes with tears in her eyes. But these weren't tears of joy, they were tears of relief. The mission was complete. She had secured the bag, she had secured the man, she had secured the future. They planned the wedding quickly. They wanted a small, intimate ceremony to respect the situation. But Jessica insisted on a church wedding. She wanted God to witness her victory. She wanted to walk down the aisle in a white dress, to be declared the lawful wife in the sight of men and angels. She wanted to erase the memory of Charlotte's engagement party forever. She chose Charlotte's dream venue. She hired Charlotte's favourite florist. And in the ultimate act of cruelty, she went into the closet and found the wedding dress Charlotte had custom ordered from Paris before the coma. It had arrived while Charlotte was sleeping. Jessica tried it on. It fit perfectly. She looked at herself in the mirror, wearing the dress of the woman she had destroyed, and smiled. She decided she would wear it. After all, Charlotte wasn't going to use it. It would be a waste to let it gather dust. As the wedding day approached, Jessica felt invincible. But she made one fatal mistake. She stopped checking. She stopped visiting the hospital. She assumed that Charlotte was as good as dead. She assumed that the slow fade poison had done irreversible damage. She was so busy planning her coronation that she forgot to check if the Queen was actually dead. 3 days before the wedding, deep in the ICU ward, a finger twitched. A monitor spiked. The brain activity that had been a flat line began to ripple like a waking ocean. Charlotte was fighting. Her body had processed the poison, and her spirit had refused to cross over. She had heard the whispers. Even in her coma, some part of her subconscious had recorded the presence of the traitor. She had heard Jessica's voice by her bedside months ago, whispering venom. She had felt the absence of her fiancé. While Jessica was fitting the wedding dress, Charlotte opened her eyes. The light was blinding. Her throat was dry. Her body felt like lead, but her mind was sharp. The nurse who found her dropped her tray in shock. She rushed to call the doctor. Charlotte couldn't speak much at first. But when the doctor asked if they should call her fiancé, Charlotte grabbed the doctor's arm with surprising strength. She shook her head. She whispered a single rasping command. No, do not call him. Bring me my phone. She needed to know what had happened while she slept. She scrolled through social media. She saw the pictures. She saw Jessica in her house. She saw the engagement announcement. She saw the wedding date. This Saturday. The rage that filled her body was better than any medicine. It pumped adrenaline through her veins. It forced her muscles to work. She wasn't going to die. She was going to crash a party. The wedding day arrived with a sky so blue, it felt like a mockery of the darkness unfolding below. The venue was a cathedral of towering stone and stained glass that demanded reverence. Inside, the pews were filled with the crème de la crème of society. Senators, tycoons, and celebrities fanned themselves with expensive programs, whispering about the tragedy of James losing his first fiancé and the miracle of him finding love again with her best friend. They called it fate. They called it God's plan. They did not know they were sitting in the pews of a crime scene. At the altar stood James. He looked handsome in his bespoke tuxedo, but his eyes were hollow. There was a twitch in his jaw, a shadow of hesitation that he couldn't quite shake. He told himself he was doing the right thing. He told himself that Jessica had saved him. But deep in his soul, he felt like an actor playing a role he hadn't rehearsed. Then the organ music swelled. The heavy wooden doors swung open. The congregation stood, and there was Jessica. She was a vision of stolen glory. She wore Charlotte's dress, the dress Charlotte had flown to Paris to design, and it fit her like a second skin. She walked down the aisle not with the humility of a bride, but with the swagger of a conqueror. She smiled at the cameras. She smiled at James. She clutched the bouquet of white roses, unaware that the thorns were about to draw blood. She reached the altar. The priest began the ceremony. He spoke of love, of truth, and of the sanctity of marriage. Jessica nodded piously, her hands folded, looking every bit the angel she pretended to be. The priest asked if there was anyone present who knew of any just cause why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. The silence that followed was heavy. Usually, this is a formality. Usually, no one speaks. But today, the silence was broken not by a voice, but by a sound. It was the sound of the heavy church doors slamming open against the walls with a violence that shook the ground. A gust of wind swept into the church, extinguishing the candles along the aisle. The congregation turned around, annoyed at the interruption, expecting a latecomer or a drunkard. What they saw made the blood freeze in their veins. Standing in the doorway, framed by the blinding sunlight from outside, was a figure. She was thin, frail, and leaning heavily on a cane. She was not dressed in wedding finery. She wore a simple hospital gown, with a coat thrown hastily over her shoulders. Her hair was unkempt, her skin was pale, but her eyes burned with the fire of 1,000 suns. It was Charlotte. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. A woman in the front row screamed and fainted. Whispers of ghost and spirit rippled through the crowd like wildfire. James's face drained of all colour. He stepped back, gripping the altar rail, his mouth opening and closing without sound. But Jessica looked like she had stared into the face of judgment itself. She began to shake. It wasn't a tremble, it was a violent vibration. She clutched James's arm, her nails digging into his suit, trying to hide behind him. She whispered frantically that it wasn't real, that it was a demon sent to torment her. Charlotte began to walk. It was a slow, painful walk. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound of her cane on the marble floor was the only sound in the massive cathedral. No one moved to stop her. It felt sacrilegious to block the path of a woman who had clawed her way back from the grave. She walked past the friends who had abandoned her. She walked past the family members who had given up hope. She walked straight to the altar. She stopped 3 feet away from the couple. The contrast was stark, the bride in stolen silk and the victim in hospital cotton. Charlotte looked at James. She saw the shock, the confusion, and the dawn of realization in his eyes. She saw him step forward, reaching out a trembling hand as if to touch her, to verify she was flesh and bone. But Charlotte did not reach back. She turned her gaze to Jessica. The look she gave her former best friend was not one of anger. It was something far worse. It was pity mixed with disgust. Jessica finally found her voice. She shrieked, accusing Charlotte of being a witch, of trying to ruin her happiness. She tried to spin the narrative even now, claiming Charlotte was jealous, that Charlotte had abandoned James, and she had picked up the pieces. Charlotte didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a smartphone. She explained to the silent room that while she lay in her coma, unable to move or speak, her hearing was the last thing to fade and the first thing to return. She explained that she had heard every whisper, and she explained that a suspicious nurse, noticing Jessica's strange behavior, had placed a recorder by the bedside. Charlotte walked over to the pulpit. She placed the phone next to the microphone that amplified the priest's sermons. She pressed play. The sound of static filled the church. And then Jessica's voice boomed through the speakers. It was unmistakable. It was arrogant, cruel, and chilling. The recording played a monologue Jessica had delivered over Charlotte's unconscious body just days ago. The congregation heard Jessica confess to poisoning the drink. They heard her mock Charlotte for being weak. They heard her brag about sleeping in Charlotte's bed and wearing Charlotte's ring. They heard her wish for Charlotte to finally die so she could stop looking over her shoulder. The recording ended. The silence that followed was louder than the scream. It was the silence of absolute horror. James looked at Jessica as if she had turned into a monster before his eyes. The woman he was seconds away from marrying was a murderer. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He looked at the ring on her finger, the ring he thought he bought for a new love, and realized it was a symbol of his own stupidity. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hand and slapped Jessica across the face. The sound echoed through the church, breaking the spell. Chaos erupted. The bride's family was screaming in shame. The groom's family was shouting for the police. Jessica fell to her knees, grabbing James's legs, begging, crying, claiming it was all for love. She said she did it because she loved him more than Charlotte ever could. But the spell was broken. Police officers, who had been called by the doctor accompanying Charlotte, marched up the aisle. They didn't care about the wedding dress. They pulled Jessica to her feet. They cuffed her hands behind her back, the same hands that had poured the poison. As they dragged her away, screaming and cursing, she looked back one last time. She saw Charlotte standing tall, alive, and victorious. The stolen dress was ruined, dragged through the dust, just like Jessica's name. When the police had gone and the crowd had dispersed, James turned to Charlotte. He was weeping openly now. He fell to his knees, begging for forgiveness. He told her he didn't know. He told her he was lonely. He promised to spend the rest of his life making it up to her. He swore to heal her, to love her, to marry her right there and then. Charlotte looked down at the man she had once thought was her soulmate. She saw his weakness. She saw that he was a man who could be easily manipulated, a man who replaced her too quickly. She realized that the poison had killed more than just her health. It had killed her love for him. She touched his cheek gently, a final gesture of goodbye. She told him that she survived the poison, but she could not survive the betrayal. She told him that some things, once broken, cannot be glued back together. She took the engagement ring which the police had removed from Jessica's finger and handed to her and dropped it into James's palm. She turned around and walked back down the aisle alone. She walked with a limp, but her head was high. She walked out of the church and into the sunlight, breathing the air of a woman who had been given a second chance at life, and she wasn't going to waste it on the past. Years later, Charlotte relocated to Paris, running her own fashion empire, looking healthier and happier than she ever was. She never spoke of Jessica. She never spoke of James. She understood that they were just chapters in her book, not the whole story. As for Jessica, she sits in a cell where the walls are grey and the days are long. She has no designer clothes. She has no expensive rings. She has only time. Time to think about the green grass she envied, and how, in her greed to eat it all, she ended up with nothing but dirt in her mouth. The lesson remains for those who have ears to hear. Be careful who you invite to your table. Be careful who you call sister. For the hand that pats you on the back may be the hand looking for the softest spot to stick the knife.